If you haven't seen my Everything We Know About Lantern Ride video, I highly recommend checking it out first. But first, let's quickly recap the most important parts of this discussion. Tao, a divine tree god, once stood as the gatekeeper between the living world and the realm of the dead in Liyue. However, the Archon War shattered that boundary and blurred the lines between life and death. One major consequence of this rupture was the emergence of Fetters of Death, a corrosive presence that accelerates lifespans, taints the living, and gives off a distinct, almost decay-like odor. The Fetters of Death originate from the underworld itself and would corrode or consume the life of any living thing, gods like Tao included. Tao decided to have himself be cleansed and turn himself into the new border. And the 8 Adepts of Liyue, humans who had power comparable to the Adepti, helped him achieve that. The ritual they used to sanctify Tao was called the 7 and 8 Gates ritual. And for the Tao sanctification, it had to obfuscate or kill the lone butterfly, which was the origin of Hu Tao's and the Wangsheng funeral parlor's practices. Today, the more simple Homa ritual of the funeral parlor can remove such fetters of death and cleanse any filth when needed, but the one in the Lantern Rite was way more than Hu Tao had thought it would be. Hu Tao mentions that the issue is with the border itself, Tao, and inside the border it's like the whole world has been turned upside down. So much so that the 7 and 8 gates method had to be used to construct one of the key nodes. This entire dilemma led us to that cutscene where Hu Tao almost dies and was saved by the Traveler because of their nature and constitution as descenders. The concept of death in Teyvat and the fact that every region has its own underworld is quite interesting in that it's a part of the game that has not ever been explained in depth outside of a few mentions and short comments. When Natlan came out, we theorized that other regions might also have night kingdoms of its own, and so far that proves to be true, but it's more accurate to call it Underworld instead. And it's also worth noting that Natlan's Underworld is different from the rest of Teyvat due to getting obliterated after the Dragon War and the abyssal corrosion of the Pyro Dragon. What I think is happening here is Hoyo sort of connecting the different forms of death throughout the game. The first form of death that was introduced to us started off as Archon Residue, being renamed to God Remains. God Remains being the emotional residue left over from the regrets and anger of gods when they die. The other is through Hu Tao's story quest, which sort of introduced death in the afterlife of Liyue, with the souls not being able to move on because of their lingering attachments to life. This was then left alone for a while until we entered Fontaine and met Skirk, who sort of explained the concept of life and death to Nouvelette. Life is a blessing in itself, but once you die, there is nothing left but curses and regrets. And then we were introduced to the Shade of Death herself, the souls of the Night Kingdom in Natlan, and the lingering dead who couldn't pass on properly in Natlan's unique ley lines, which was fixed because of Sir Balanke's deal, Mawika's plan to defeat the Abyss, and the Captain's paradox with Renova. And finally, in the Lantern Rite, we're told that there are indeed underworlds where the dead would go to in each region, and that the underworld constantly emits a fetter of death that leaks into the realm of the living. Something I think is different from Teyvat's regions and respective underworlds is Khaenri'ah, which is already deep below underground. Now, a place living underground might be a bit too close to the underworld already, and there's also the possibility that Khaenri'ah doesn't have a clear border between life and death. The lack of a clear border would explain why life in Khaenri'ah isn't exactly natural, or that there is no natural life there. Simply because life and death might have been blurred, that any form of life can't survive on its own. The fact that no gods live in Khaenri'ah as well just adds to the level of difficulty that Khaenri'ahns had to face there. And whatever happens to humans or any forms of life that dies can only be explained by Skirk's words about life and death.
To live in itself is a blessing. But once a person dies, the bonds he once had with this world shall all turn to curses.
What do you mean by that?
No need to fret. These are just my personal thoughts, and my reason for no longer wishing to return to the surface.
Hu Tao's lineage and the Wangsheng funeral parlor's rituals revolve around the use of fire, not just as a burial rite, but as a means of purification. This stems from the lone butterfly's original practice, which was used to cleanse fetters of death, lingering curses, and unresolved regrets. The Staff of Homa itself emphasizes this connection, stating that those who wield the flame will inevitably be faced with imposing darkness, and that only a pure flame can purify the world, a likely reference to the inevitability of death, abyssal corruption, or even Celestia's hidden laws. But something I want you guys to focus on is the concept of annihilation instead of cleansing. since Natlan used the Sacred Flame and the Rule of Death to defeat the Abyss, creating an annihilation cleansing attack. This is why the Traveler relates the Abyss to Fetters of Death, and why they thought about reconstructing ley lines. Because Liwa's cleansing ritual is, in a sense, an annihilation reaction to remove death. Now keep this relation between annihilation and cleansing in mind for now because they can be interchangeable for the remainder of this video. The only depictions of burning things we have are the one from Sumeru teaser and the Torii from Winter Night's Lazo. Not only that, we also have Piero and the Tsaritsa who mentions burning away the old world.
But Rosaline, I promise you, your final resting place will be the entirety of the old world.
The other somewhat related mention is the Doomsday of the world, which is in the Nartisan Kreuz Ordo. All of these are part of the main story, by the way, but we've yet to see the Torii actually burn Irminsul-like trees in-game or see this scene right here from the Sumeru teaser. I've made a video long ago during Sumeru about the Torii and the Parable of the Tree, but I've also recently made videos on everything we know about Snezhnaya, as well as the one for Lantern Rite, and all of those videos focus on the end result of Teyvat being burned or cleansed using a purifying flame. Previously, I theorized that the Torii might have played the role of the gardener, tasked with cutting the spirit tree. But upon re-examining the lore, it seems more likely that he isn't just mimicking the ritual, he's weaponizing it. Rather than merely cutting down a leyline-linked tree as part of some experiment, the Torii's goal appears to be harnessing the raw energy within Irminsul's network itself. This aligns with his obsession with blasphemous human elevation. He's not cleansing these remnants like Taudo's ritual, he's siphoning their powers to fuel something far more dangerous. But therein lies the question, why siphon from trees? Well, that tree might just be a particularly large leyline outcrop. We know that Irminsul is a repository for information and memories, but there are multiple smaller variants called petrified trees, withered trees, or mini Irminsuls all over Teyvat. All of them are quite deep underground, as well as heavily connected to the underworlds of each region. The Sacred Sakura in Inazuma and the Weeping Willow in Fontaine are one such examples. Modifying a cleansing ritual to absorb powers from leyline trees is essentially stealing Irminsul's memories from the world, but it's also stealing Irminsul's power to manipulate and even overwrite memories. To someone like the Torii who wishes to elevate human ability, taking the power of the Irminsul itself is one of the ways he can climb that dangerous ladder, possibly making his own specimen that is unbound by Irminsul's and Celestia's rules and even breach the fake sky, which would lead us to the possible creation of a Descender. And it might not be exclusive to trees either, since he's now currently in Nod Cry and was able to spy on the Ancient Moon's remnants in Natlan. Now, if siphoning Irminsul trees can allow humans to theoretically manipulate memories, then siphoning power from the Ancient Moon from the Era of Dragons, as well as researching Nod Cry's primordial powers, would allow him to create a dragon or god of his own, and even be able to face whatever is outside of Teyvat's fake world. Tangent. Chemia is the creation of life, and the peak of creating life is the creation of human life. This makes sense since there's absolutely no form of life in Conria, and also why Rhine-Daughter could only experiment using corpses and objects instead of living things like trees. This is the magnum opus of Rhine-Daughter, the Master of Albedo, who, if you can still remember, is a puppet or homunculus. And Rhine-Daughter is now in possession of what's known as the Heart of Naberius, which we can assume as the heart of a fallen god. So could Rhine-Daughter also be making something similar to what the Torii is doing? She's already created Rift Hounds, Durin, and Albedo, so what's stopping her from making another primordial human god? Back to Snezhnaya, the Torii's own plans isn't really the real plan of the Fatui, since each Harbinger has their own selfish goals for joining and for assisting the Tsaritsa. This cold camaraderie and contract is also why Pantalone is in cahoots with the Torii, since Pantalone hates the fact that Zhongli controlled the power of Mora, while Capitano was looking for a place for Conrians and lost souls to rest, which led him to becoming Natlan's leyline master. And the same goes for the rest of the Harbingers, and it might include Piero as well. Apart from the fact that Piero seems to always be there when the Tsaritsa is mentioned, Piero's own plans might be more connected with the Tsaritsa's vision after the Cataclysm. The Tsaritsa is theorized to be the god of love due to the various voice lines of other harbingers. But her gemstone hints at a deeper and more reversed meaning of love, translating into variations of grieving ice or weeping ice, which is a wordplay with the same meaning of love in Chinese and Japanese. But this air quotes love might be a bit deeper than just caring for her people, rather a more obsessive sin of loving something too much, to the point that she'd planned to see the world burn away because of the sin of love. And what better way to show it to your people or all of Teyvat than to purify the world with a pure flame? This is where I want you to think of cleansing as an annihilation reaction instead. Now, why would the Tsaritsa and the Fatui resort to worldwide purification by fire? One possibility is a total reset of Teyvat's fundamental laws. By gathering all 7 gnosis and tapping into Irminsul's core energy, she might be planning to burn away the old world, not just in a metaphorical sense but through a literal second cataclysm. This could serve 2 purposes: severing Celestia's control and purging every last trace of abyssal corruption and fetters of death. Essentially, along with Project Stuja, it might be the first step in a carefully calculated 2-stage purification process. First, a mass cryogenic suspension, preserving life in ice, and then a controlled ignition that obliterates everything deemed impure. The Gnosis is directly connected to Celestia, while the Irminsul is connected to memories of the world. But apart from their goal to be at war with the rest of the world, they're also dealing with the threat of the Abyss, which they seem to constantly interact with. So a similar 7 and 8 gates method using these 7 gnosis would just be their main plan. There's also the fact that the gnosis is made from the remains of the 3rd Descender, which may have well been created through a purification ritual after a Descender dies. If a god like Taodo needed to be cleansed with fire before becoming a sanctified border, then who's to say that a Descender can't be purified using the 7 Dragon Lords' authorities? Descender's remains might be the same as god remains too, since the gnosis are objects of misfortune. Lantern Rite and the summer events often hint at the next region, so it's no surprise that this year's Lantern Rite was focused on death, purification, fire, and the numbers 7 and 8. Snezhnaya being the 7th region, and then leads us to the 8th, which is Khaenri'ah and the Abyss. So is the Tsaritsa planning to cleanse the world of any abyss or death? Is she trying to annihilate the fetters that could be leaking in Snezhnaya? Or is she planning to reset Snezhnaya's ley lines using the Gnosis and a fiery ritual to be unbound from Celestia's rules? It's very possible that she wants to achieve all 3. But before this grand burning of the old world, we must first endure her bitter cold, which is where Project Stuja fits into. If you've watched my Snezhnaya video, the Tsaritsa might have an innate regional power to encase things in ice, which you could see from the Winter Night's lasso. She uses this cryo power to encase Senora in ice, keeping her dead, but not really decaying, which might negate her from moving into the underworld. This encasing power is going to be a big factor in Snezhnaya, and it might be the Tsaritsa's way to save those who die. If we base it on the Lantern Rite, it may imply that Snezhnaya's underworld isn't functioning or is merged with Snezhnaya. You may wonder why the Tsaritsa would be using death paired with something that combats the abyss like ley line energy or pure elemental fire and ice. Well, the easiest answer to that is to create an annihilation reaction so big that it wipes all the abyss and the rest of the world in one big cleansing ritual. If you're familiar with Evangelion, then awakening a primordial life form and releasing its energies leads to what is called an impact in the series. And Genshin Impact might just end with a similarly inspired result to human instrumentality. I mean, we already have the Jewish Kabbalah since 1.0 and the heavy concepts of alchemy and chemia, so I guess it's not that surprising. Project Stuja, Nodcry's primordial powers, the Torre's burning experiments, and the Lantern Rite's cleansing ritual are all connected to one thing, and that's death. All forms of death, god remains, fetters of death, curses after one dies, the abyss, the ancient moon's remnants, which is theorized to be a dead moon sister, the primordial dragons that fell, and even the remains of the 3rd Descender, which became a gnosis. Everything in Snezhnaya, as well as what they're doing, is related to dead things and has something to do with death. And the shade of death, Renova, popping up in Natlan is also related to this, as her rule of death and immortality persists on what was supposed to be dead already, the Khaenri'ahs. Dainsleif also likely has something to say about this in 5.6, and we'll get a summer event in 5.8 connecting this focus on death and purification. Death is everywhere, and the Tsaritsa wants to cleanse her people, as well as maybe even Khaenri'ah of that death. And she might be planning to use the same dead remains to create her own 7 and 8 gates method, taking the Gnosis, which is linked to key regions, and freezing all of Teyvat with her cryo power, followed by the annihilation ritual to reset the world, unchained by Celestia's rules and by any form of fetter or abyssal corruption. This is exactly why Arlecchino and Child were called back to participate in Project Stuja, and dare I say why every Harbinger is connected to it. Through Arlecchino, the Ancient Moon's remnants could be studied and activated, or maybe even siphoned for its power, connecting to the ancient Bale Moon Bloodfire as a fuse to start the Annihilation ritual. Through Child, they have a perfect bulwark who could use the power of the Abyss and even siphon abyssal power, basically absorbing as much abyssal power as possible, creating a human god that the Tori wants, someone that combats Celestia's power as the Abyss, and through the Tsaritsa herself, the 7 Gnosis, as well as Snezhnaya's crystallization phenomenon, they can completely cover the world in ice. Snezhnaya's whole overarching plan to use a freezing ritual and fire annihilation is a suicide mission to reset all of Teyvat's laws while keeping all life in Teyvat from perishing using ice. This is why Piero's words to Senora was that her final resting place will be the eternity of the old world. A world free from Celestia's laws, but also one where all manner of fetters and curses, which includes the Abyss, is purged and annihilated using elemental power. The Tsaritsa could be planning to hit 2 birds with 1 stone, rather using 7 and 8 stones. But just like obfuscating the main caster, it's likely going to cost the life of the Tsaritsa, which may be interesting since we could lose a playable Archon. But I highly doubt that since we'll lose out on one of the most hyped characters in the game. But regardless, this I think is how Snezhnaya's story is going to pan out based on the most recent Lantern Rite and what we know from the end of Natlan Archon quest. Khaenri'ah's status as a godless nation as well as a nation underground raises questions of what happens to its dead. Unlike Liyue, where the sanctified Tao Do acts as a border between life and death, and other regions which has a ley line connected to it, Khaenri'ah has no such division and possibly no ley lines, suggesting that its deceased might never pass on in a traditional sense. This could explain why abyssal corruption takes hold so easily. Instead of souls moving on, they fester, becoming part of the abyss itself. Renova's role as a Shade of Death is also relevant here. If Khaenri'ah's curse was an indirect consequence of rejecting death, then Renova might have a hand in enforcing a twisted form of immortality upon them. The paradox is that Khaenri'ahs aren't truly immortal, yet they also cannot die in the way that mortals should. If the Tsaritsa's purification aims to reset the laws of Teyvat, it may finally allow Khaenri'ahs to rest, or maybe even erase them entirely. Renova's rule of death is absolute, yet the Tsaritsa's plan to cleanse Teyvat with fire presents a major contradiction. If Renova enforces the balance between life and death and immortality, then how would she react to a large-scale purification that erases death itself? If she intervenes, then she risks disrupting her own laws. Yet if she allows the purification to happen, she might inadvertently violate her duty and, well, awaken Celestia. Now, this could explain why she remained neutral in Natlan. The paradox of absolute death and absolute purification is something that she can't really control. However, if Celestia does react to such an act and awakens, either to prevent Teyvat's complete annihilation, or Celestia establishes a new rule, or just straight up drop another nail. While the Fatui's plan appears to be a direct rebellion against Celestia, what if Celestia actually wants this purification to happen? And that this was their plan all along, using the power of ley lines and the Third Descender's remains. If Celestia controls the laws of Teyvat, then it's possible that a world reset is already written into its design, which is exactly how samsaras work and what Nahida may have been implying all along.
Everything in this world runs in a loop.
Project Stuja may not be a rogue operation, but a calculated event that Celestia is allowing to play out. If this is the case, then the Tsaritsa's rebellion is just another part of Celestia's grand plan. Additionally, the 5 sinners who exist outside of conventional laws may see this as an opportunity. If Celestia's control is weakened, they could rise to power and ensuing chaos. So could the Tsaritsa unknowingly be playing into their hands instead? These possibilities do raise the stakes even further and leave us wondering whether the real threat is purification or what comes after it. And there we go, all of my thoughts put together in a sort of cohesive way regarding what I think what would happen in Snezhnaya and what I think the Tsaritsa plans to do with the Gnosis once she gets all three of them, as well as what I think of Project Stuja and all the old world lore drops we've gotten from Natlan. If you've enjoyed this theory about something that won't happen until 6 months later, or if my mad ravings made you giggle a bit, then please leave a like, comment below which Evangelion ending you liked, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to see more content like these. I've always thought that Genshin Impact had similarities with Evangelion, and making a video connecting that same result was definitely a fun topic to tackle. I'm sure I've missed quite a lot of points too, so please correct me in the comments if you have any clarifications. In all honesty, we might have a similar ending to Honkai Impact 3rd, since Kiana made a sort of compromise to embrace finality and control death and rebirth, or in Genshin's case, control the samsara that we live through. But instead of having something like the finality, it's through the concept of descenders instead. Anyway, I've taken enough time already, so I'll see you guys in the next video, yeah? As always, like, comment, join, comment, more bell, more ramblings, and stay mad theorists. Bye!